Shall we start?
Sure, up to you.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, or at least good evening to all of you in this part of the globe, and welcome to everybody from everywhere. And we really have people from quite a lot of different parts of the world. Many of you will have seen that there is also a live stream on YouTube. We are recording this. It will afterwards be available on YouTube as well, but we might cut some parts. So welcome to the BIAA-ARIT co-organized webinar, although that's a bit of a strange word. So online lecture, let's put it in that way. Recent discoveries at Sardis from the Bronze Age until the end of antiquity. You will see three people on screen. I'm Lucas van der Put. I'm the director of the British Institute at Ankara. Dr. Elif Denel, maybe you can wave, Elif, so that the screen goes to you.
Yes.
Yes, he's director of ARIT, and then, of course, our distinguished speaker, Professor Nick Cahill from Wisconsin-Madison. Now, before Elif will introduce Nick in a bit in depth, let's put it in that way, I'll walk you through how we would like to do this. Most of you will be much better at working with Zoom webinars than I am, but nevertheless, I'm going to give it a try. The chat is open, as many of you have already realized, and we would like to encourage you to leave your name, or you can also give comments to Nick. The raise your hand function will not be used because we are too many. Therefore, we would like you to write your questions to the Q&A. And once Nick is ready with his lecture, I'll read out the questions to everyone and Nick will answer. All attendees, as well as Elif and myself, will be muted during the lecture, so there should not be anything else but Nick talking. And anybody else but Nick talking to us. So Elif, I would like to hand the word to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Lut. This lecture, as many of you know, we wanted to have in person about 3 months ago, right before we, or right when we were locked in to our houses, basically. But I'm really, really great that we're happy that we are able to have this event, at least on Zoom, but I am hoping that we can repeat it at some point in the future when we're able to move around in the world. So I know Nick periodically comes to Turkey, would like to come many, many times. So I'm hoping that this we can repeat again very soon. It's really a great honor to introduce Nick Cahill for me. As you know, he's from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but he holds a BA in classical archaeology with high honors in Greek from the University of Michigan. He has an MA and a PhD in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology from the University of California at Berkeley. He has taught at Harvard and since 1993 at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's been a professor there holding since 2016 the chair of Simona and Jerome Chazen Distinguished Chair in Art History. He's worked at various excavations, but as he pointed out earlier when we were chatting, since 1979 at Sardis. So he's been really deeply rooted there. And of course, he worked with the late Professor Crawford Greenwald, who's been a great supporter of ARIT as well, whom we know as Greenie. He's been the director of Sardis Excavations since 2008. And also he has served in ARIT in very many positions, including vice president between 2010 and 2015. So tonight, Professor Cahill will share with us his ongoing work at Sardis. In his lecture, already pointed out as recent discoveries at Sardis from the Bronze Age until the end of antiquity. And here, if you were in a big room, we would be clapping. So I'm just going to be hiding myself and let you take the microphone.
Well, thank you, Lut, and thank you, Elif. And I think I should share my desktop then, and let me see if this works.
Yes, it does.
And we should see, tell me, we should see a map. Is that correct? Good. Well, thank you to both of you. Last summer, 2019, was the 62nd consecutive season of excavation by Harvard and Cornell universities at Sardis, and we would normally be there now. And of course, we still hope for it to go for a short season, but I'm nonetheless grateful for this opportunity to give this talk, even if it's not at the headquarters of the British Institute in Ankara and the American Institute of Research in Turkey. And many, many thanks to Lut and to Elif for putting this together after that original lecture scheduled for March had to be canceled due to this damn virus. Well, Sardis, located in Western Turkey, was one of the capital cities of Asia. Its Roman inhabitants in the 2nd century AD were very proud of the antiquity of their city, describing themselves as autochthonous of the earth, protochthonous, first of the earth, a word unique to Sardis, and as the mother city of Asia and all Lydia and of Greece. An ambitious claim to be the mother city of Greece itself. Sardis looked back on an illustrious history reaching back to the earliest days of Greek myth. The hero Heracles had been enslaved to a queen of Sardis named Omphale, and more recently, King Midas of Phrygia had washed the golden touch away by bathing in the Pactolus River, which then ran rich with gold. That gold made the inhabitants of Sardis, who were called the Lydians, the richest people in the world, and led them to invent the world's first coins. Their wealth apparently led the Lydians to establish the first empire in Turkey since the Hittites, conquering the Greeks along the coast and the Anatolian inhabitants as far as the Halys River during the 7th and 6th centuries BC. And we know about their rise to power almost completely through Greek sources. And the Greeks had very mixed feelings about the Lydians. On the one hand, who doesn't admire such vast wealth and power? But on the other hand, the Greeks considered themselves above mere riches, as Archilochus proclaimed, "I care not for the wealth of Gyges rich in gold." Standing at the border between Greece and the Near East, then between Greece East and West, Sardis offers opportunities to explore how perceived cultural divisions arose, which still frame political geography and interactions. Sardis stands not only at a crucial location in space, but it occupied a long span of time, offering us opportunities to study the transformation of this city from a small regional center to a major empire that conquered most of Western Anatolia, and its famous and catastrophic destruction. In about 547 BC, its last king, Croesus, wanted to expand his empire and so attacked the rising power to the east, the Persians, newly ruled by Cyrus. Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi and was told that if he attacked Cyrus, he would destroy a great enemy. And so he did so, and the prophecy came true, but it was the wrong empire that he destroyed. The story has become a paradigm for the foolish king misled by an ambiguous oracle of the mighty brought low. Sardis remained an important place as the Western satrapal capital of the Persian Empire, and this transformation from the center of power to a node of a larger empire is one of particular interest to me, but is the subject of another talk. The transformation of the Lydian city to a Greek polis, the Western capital of the Seleucid Empire, the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire, was the subject of a recent interdisciplinary project headed by Paul Kosman and Andrea Berlin, and their publication, Spear One Land, was published last summer. The richest and in many ways best known era of Sardis is, of course, its Roman period, when it was one of the major metropolises of Asia. The city housed two temples of the imperial cult, one in the temple of Artemis and the other in the city center, which we'll look at in a moment, as well as baths, theaters, and other institutions of the Roman city. It suffered, however, a quick and devastating collapse in the early 7th century AD, at a time when cities all over Asia Minor were being transformed to something quite different, and we'll return to this as well. Occupation at Sardis did not come to an end, but it was never a metropolis or a major urban center again. It still renames the same name, Sart, however, as it has since the beginning of recorded history. Faced with this wealth of history and important questions, where to begin? When Professor Hanfmann founded the expedition in 1958, he undertook many projects, but two stand out. First, he excavated and then reconstructed the Bath Gymnasium complex and the synagogue he discovered in its southeastern corner, the largest synagogue in the ancient world. This was a major undertaking, the first large-scale restoration of an ancient building in Turkey, and it's emblematic of Sardis today and has served as a model for later reconstruction projects. He also then wanted to learn about the Lydians. After all, there's lots of Hellenistic and Roman sites, but if you want to learn about these native Anatolian people and the rise of one of the first great Iron Age empires, Sardis is the only place to do so. Professor Hanfmann therefore followed the account of Herodotus, who writes that the Agora, the civic center of Sardis in 499 BC, at the time of the Ionian revolt, was located along the banks of the Pactolus River. Professor Hanfmann's excavations at Pactolus Cliff revealed a wealth of early Lydian pottery. Excavation at Sector Pactolus North found one of the earliest gold refineries. And finally, excavations at the so-called House of Bronzes sectors went from the 6th and 7th centuries BC, the 8th centuries, all the way back to the late Bronze Age, maybe 1000 or 1200 BC, the earliest levels discovered at Sardis until last summer. All these sectors consisted of rather small-scale buildings consisting of 1 or 2 rooms, irregular alleys, and Professor Hanfmann thus envisioned Sardis as a sort of a ramshackle lower town without any particular organization or density, dominated by the royal palace on the Acropolis, where he had excavated Lydian terrace walls along the north slope of the citadel. He further concluded that the city of Sardis moved in the Hellenistic period from along the Pactolus to the region north of the Acropolis, where we find that theater and stadium, basilicas, Roman temples, and other major remains within the late Roman city wall. In 1976, Professor Hanfmann retired and Professor Greenwald, or Greenie, took over as excavation director. And in that year, we discovered that a hillock, which most people had assumed was just a natural hill, was actually artificial, made of solid mud brick, immediately identified by Andrew Ramage as the Lydian city wall. Greenie made this one of the primary foci of excavation and research for the next 30 years, and it was published originally as the eastern city wall of the city. But Greenie never took anything for granted. He never believed that he had the final answer, but rather followed the archaeology, tracing the city wall around to the east rather than to the west, as we had expected, and discovered, to our surprise, that the Lydian city wall did not enclose a city along the Pactolus, as Professor Hanfmann had surmised, but one to the east, underneath the Hellenistic and Roman cities. The Bath, Synagogue, Hob, PN, and the other sectors of excavation now turn out to be outside the Lydian city wall. In recent years, therefore, we focused on learning more about the city core in all its periods, both of the Lydian city, which it turns out we knew essentially nothing about, and also to investigate the long urban history of this metropolis. And we've concentrated on those areas in the center. We focused excavation on 2 terraces in the very center of the city, on the foothills of the Acropolis. The lower terrace, called Field 55, was a Roman sanctuary of the Imperial cult, and the upper terrace, Field 49, was, I believe, part of the Lydian palace complex. One of the most remarkable features of this and the adjacent hill, so-called Biz Fort, shown on the left, was that they were both enclosed in the Lydian period by monumental terrace walls, which regularized, organized, monumentalized, and separated this region from the lower regions of Sardis. The terrace wall on Biz Fort stood 12 meters high and dates to the 6th century BC, the period of the Lydians' greatest expansion. And the transformation of the natural landscape is one of the most distinctive features of Lydian urbanism, and these terraces established the urban structure of Sardis for the rest of its long history. The north slope of Field 49, where we're working now, was terraced by a boulder wall 3 meters thick and more than 45 meters long, the most conspicuous monument of Lydian architecture now visible at the city site. When it was discovered in 1981, we believed that this was outside the Lydian city, of course. When we finally figured out where the city was, this terrace was one of the clues that this was part of an elite and probably palatial quarter. So we returned to learn more about the complex history of Lydian terracing here, and Güzin Eren, formerly of Ankara of Metu and now of Boston University, has bravely dug on this steep slope for 8 seasons now. One important goal has been determined to find the date of that boulder wall. Its rough construction looked rather early, and its monumental size implies that this is a major undertaking of a powerful state. In the 80s, Greeny had dated it provisionally to the 7th century BC, the time of Gyges and those other historical Lydian kings, partly on the basis of historical probability. But we've long been suspicious of that date, and Güzin found pottery associated with the wall, which seemed rather earlier, but also later pieces as well of the 6th century BC. After a number of seasons, last summer, Güzin proved essentially conclusively that it really is 2 phases, the earlier of the 8th century BC, and then a later repair. To learn more about the date of this structure, we took sediment samples for optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL dating. This technology can, they say, date the last time a sediment saw the light of the sun, and so the samples have to be taken in the dead of night and handled with extreme care. We're awaiting the results of these, and we hope to get them actually this week or something. So it's frustrating not to be able to tell you what those are. Güzin then excavated down the slope of the hill and distinguished 3 more phases of terracing, one of them fully 5 meters thick there, and built again of massive boulders with a limestone face, a monumental undertaking requiring transporting these huge boulders to the top of the hill and also tens of thousands of cubic meters of fill to create the terrace behind them, and then another further reinforcement. Güzin's careful excavation found evidence dating this last phase to the late 7th or the first half of the 6th century BC, the period of Sardis's greatest expansion. Now, 2 summers ago, when she expanded her excavations to follow this wall westward, she found, sort of typically at Sardis, that the wall had completely disappeared, probably robbed out in the Achaemenid period after the Persian capture of Sardis in 547. And this in itself is sort of interesting. We wondered why this monumental wall was so relatively poorly preserved. And the reason may be that it was almost completely robbed out after the Persian sack to reuse the stones in other buildings. And this adds further weight to an observation we've made over the past years, that while we find lots of Lydian remains here in central Sardis and lots of Hellenistic and Roman remains, there's almost nothing from the period of Cyrus's capture for the city in 547 until well after Alexander arrived. He arrived in 334 BC. Rather, we find evidence of massive robbing of the Lydian palace and terrace walls, removing them to more than 3 meters below contemporary ground level. So after they conquered Sardis, the Persians didn't simply move into the old buildings and continue the status quo. Instead, they tore them down and left the city center almost completely abandoned for more than 200 years. The Lydian buildings supported by these huge terrace walls are now mostly gone, robbed out like the terrace or eroded and destroyed by later construction. But Güzin discovered and last season completed the plan of an earlier building apparently predating the terrace wall, so earlier than the 8th century BC. This is a square building about 5 by 5 meters with thick mud brick walls with sockets for massive wooden posts, almost certainly supporting a second story, making it quite a substantial structure. There's not much pottery associated with this building, and mostly it can't be closely dated. But what we do have seems to be early, maybe early 8th or 9th century, and a carbon-14 date from last summer gives a date for this charcoal of between 996 and 837 BC, making this the earliest known monumental building at Sardis so far, dating to a time when, for instance, Greek cities were really not building anything this monumental. And again, we're waiting on OSL dating to confirm this, but in the meantime, let me just point out how much Guzin's work has changed our understanding of Sardis. Most of what we know about Lydian history comes from Greek poets and historians like Archilochus and Herodotus, who write about those powerful kings of the Mermnad dynasty of the 7th and 6th centuries BC, Gyges and Sadiates, Aliates and Croesus. Since these are the people we know about, we naturally assumed that Sardis rose to importance only when the Greeks began to write about it, and therefore Sardis developed more or less in step with the Greek polises of Ionia, which also became urbanized in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. We saw so much of Sardis through this Greek lens. But Greek literature doesn't even begin until Homer in the late 8th or 7th century BC, and history not until a couple centuries later. The absence of Greek records of earlier Lydian history, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that Sardis was an unimportant place, but just that the Greeks weren't writing about it. Guzin's excavations therefore show us that the Lydians were building monumental architecture on the site of its later palace centuries before Gyges and centuries before the neighboring Greek cities were constructing anything on this scale. It puts them more in line with developments further east in Phrygia and the Neo-Hittite states. From the Lydian point of view, it suggests that the previous dynasty that I mentioned, the Heraclids, was much more important than we had realized. And the history of this shadowy period is known to us only through very fragmentary accounts by Greek historians whose works are mostly lost, like Nicolaus of Damascus or Xanthos of Lydia. And here I just have to digress for a moment to mention one of my favorite discoveries of the last few years, a tiny fragmentary inscription from the sanctuary of the Imperial cult, which I'll talk about next. Discovered in 2013 and published last summer. Georg Petzel, who published it, recognized that this scrap with hardly a single word preserved, a single full word preserved, was a fragment of a historical chronicle recounting major historical events and how long ago they occurred from the point of view of the author. So for instance, from the year that Coroebus, who was the first victor in the Olympic Games in 776 BC, from the year that he was victorious, some number of years, which is lost. It seems then to discuss events of early Lydian history, mentioning Heracles or the Heraclid dynasty, Sadiates and Ardes, the names of early kings and children, and something about ruled. Those kings, Sadiates and Ardes, are listed by Herodotus as kings of the Mermnad dynasty, the grandson and son, respectively, of the dynasty's founder, Gyges. But other Greek historians, those ones whose works are not well preserved, remembered them also as kings of the earlier dynasty as well. And just a couple months ago, Peter Thoneman connected this fragment with a story connected with these earlier kings when Sadiates was succeeded by his twin sons, Ardes and Cades' wife killed her husband, sent his brother into exile, and ruled with his cousin for 2 years until Ardes overthrew the usurper and then ruled happily for another 70 years. My point is not to discuss early Lydian history, which realistically is probably lost to us unless we find the rest of that stone, but to point out that the Romans knew about this early dynasty, had good, maybe even chronographic records of it, and realized its importance, which we have lost together with so much of ancient literature. And only the archaeology can show us how important this early period was and how entirely different Lydian history was from Greek. Well, anyway. Towards the center of this hill is another trench which we began in 2012 and have dug every year since. The theory was that we would find the western city wall, the western terrace wall, which we had already discovered in a trench further south. And that wall is contemporary in the trench further south, is contemporary with Gazine's boulder wall and has an upper phase built of limestone like the terraces on Biz Fort. Roman remains had been excavated in previous seasons, and this is where, for instance, in 2015, we discovered a rather wonderful divinatory triangle with figures of Hecate and magical incantations on it. And that's been published recently by Will Bruce. So a couple years ago, and there with Will, we found a limestone wall exactly on line with that Lydian terrace wall we were expecting. It's built of limestone, as I say, worked with a flat chisel, typical Lydian construction technique. So what else could it be but the terrace wall that we were expecting? It made perfect sense, which is exactly why, of course, it was wrong. Excavation showed that this was not Lydian, but Hellenistic, dating to the period after Alexander the Great, and built entirely out of reused Lydian blocks. So like the Persians, the Hellenistic builders too used the Lydian palace as a quarry for their own monumental buildings. Further down, though, we did find our first stretch of real Lydian masonry worthy of the Palace of Croesus, which survived the deep robbing of most of the hill. This beautifully cut limestone wall with drafted edges and rusticated corners is well known at Sardis in structures like the main gates into the city and terrace walls on the Acropolis, which we believe to be palatial structures. However, the wall that we found runs perpendicular to the terrace we were expecting and then turns a corner on a slightly different alignment. Like the Hellenistic buildings, these Lydian structures are so large and so deeply buried that it's really hard to understand them in the relatively small areas that we are forced to work in. Now you can see in the scarp of the trench there a red line, which is the burned floor between two walls. In and on this floor were found 3 Lydian arrowheads of the type associated with the Lydians and found in very large numbers, found all over this hill. Previous excavations has found, as I said, 40 or 50 more of these, and skeletons of at least 2 individuals, or rather bits and pieces of a couple of individuals. And this burned floor and the arrowheads then seem to be the destruction debris remaining from the capture of Sardis by Cyrus. And one can imagine here the scene described by Bacchylides with Croesus in his palace, surrounded by his wife and mourning daughters awaiting the onslaught of Cyrus's soldiers. I don't mean to get too maudlin or romantic here, but one of the remarkable things about working at Sardis is that one does occasionally get to deal with the material remains of world-changing historical events, like the defeat of the Lydians and the rise of the Persian Empire, as Croesus managed to destroy a great empire, his own. And I still get a little bit emotional in actually handling arrowheads left over from this historic event. Over the last couple of summers, then, we've had to carefully dismantle the many, more than a dozen phases of Hellenistic and Roman occupation in order to uncover more of this terrace wall and the associated destruction debris. And this is slow, complex work which demands an experienced excavator with the patience of Job. At the end of last summer, we had nearly finished, and had we been able to work this summer as planned, we would right now be uncovering, I hope, more of this building and the Persian destruction layer. But that makes being stuck at home and having to talk to you from my attic even that much more frustrating. Well, anyway, I mentioned the Sardians' own pride in their antiquity, that they were the first of the earth, born from this very soil. But that's not the story we get from ancient historians. Strabo tells us that Sardis was only founded after the Trojan War, so in the 1100s or 1200s. Which is much later than Sardis's neighbors like Ephesus or Miletus. So why do the Lydians harp on their own antiquity? Our view of Lydia in the Bronze Age was transformed by Christopher Roosevelt's discovery and excavation of the site of Kaimakcha across the valley on the Gygean Lake. This late Bronze Age site, larger than Troy itself, is believed to have been the capital of the region, the Seha Riverland mentioned in Hittite records, and the hub of a network of citadels and settlements around the Gygean Lake. And there are earlier settlements here as well. David Mitten excavated important early Bronze Age sites on the lakeshore in the 1960s. Excavations at Sardis, though, had revealed only very slight remains of the late Bronze Age and nothing earlier. After the Late Bronze Age, we find a continuous occupation through the Iron Age and into the Roman and Byzantine periods. We therefore had hypothesized that at the end of the Late Bronze Age, when everything is changing throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean, the focus of occupation moved from Kymakcha to Sardis and about 1200 or 1000 BC. But this, of course, was based on remarkably little actual data. Another goal of this central trench then was to investigate the early history of occupation on this hill, to see when it was first terraced and monumentalized and, we think, became the site of the Lydian palace. We'd been told by geologists that this was a naturally flat-topped spur and so perhaps a good place for an early settlement high above the plain with a commanding view. When did the Lydians begin to develop this hill, enclosing this natural spur with terrace walls to level the surface and expand the livable space? So in 2016, Will Bruce excavated a small sondage and went through about 5 meters of sterile fill, which the Lydians had brought here to raise and level their terrace before building. This fill seems to date to the first half of the 6th century BC, at the height of the Lydian Empire, rather than earlier. And I have to admit, I was surprised and a bit disappointed not to find the early Iron Age here, as we had found 8th and 9th century remains in Guzin's trench further north. But at the bottom of his trench, he did begin to find some earlier pottery. So we expanded and continued to dig. Beneath the Lydian terrace fill, Will dug 2 meters of occupation deposits with whole pots, lenses of burning and ash, and other remains datable to the Late Bronze Age, including this wonderful nosed vessel similar to things from Beje-Sultan. 2 experts in Bronze Age ceramics, Fulya Dedeoğlu from Beje-Sultan and Peter Pavuk from Troy and Kymakcha and elsewhere, brought different outside perspectives on this previously completely unknown phase of Sardis's history, and they agreed that this material is mostly Late Bronze Age, maybe about 1200 BC, and we're very excited about finding this new occupation phase of Sardis's history. As the season went on, though, Will kept digging, but failed to find the bottom. The sondage just kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper, reaching 5, 10, 15 meters. Here we are looking at that pottery again, I'm sorry. Below ground level, and finally reaching bedrock at a depth of 14 meters, and not the height of a 5-story building, and not the flat, easily buildable ground surface that the geologists had predicted, but a steep slope which would have been impossible to build on without terracing. He'd gone through about 4 meters of almost sterile gravel with just coarse pebbles and rocks, a few small sherds of pottery, and with pottery very different from what he had been finding in those Late Bronze Age levels before. When the experts looked at this pottery, they dated it not to the Late Bronze Age, not to the Late Bronze Age, but here we are with that, but to the early Bronze Age, the early Bronze 3B period of about 2000 BC. And we took a special trip to Beje-Sultan to confirm this with Fulya Hanım and other experts. Unexpected as it is, they seem to agree that we've just added about another millennium to Sardis's long history. Carbon-14 dates from the bottom of this trench date to the 3rd millennium BC, a bit earlier than the pottery, but they are judged on tiny bits of charcoal that could have come from the inner parts of trees, which were hundreds of years old when they were cut. Again, we have OSL samples, but again, they haven't come back yet. Now, it's obviously very risky to extrapolate too much from such a tiny exposure, but that is what archaeologists do, and I won't let the risk stop me. First, we discovered that this is not a naturally flat hill, but was a steep slope, the bedrock a meter below surface on the east edge, but more than 14 meters deep on the west. Without terracing, this area would have been uninhabitable. And the sloping, sterile fills of sand and gravel with early Bronze Age pottery are so similar to later Lydian terrace fills that it seems kind of justified to conclude that this really is an early Bronze Age terrace, even though we haven't yet discovered a retaining wall for it. It is significant to have discovered early Bronze Age remains at Sardis for the first time, lengthening, as I say, the city's history dramatically. But even more significant, maybe, is that this is not just houses or relatively small-scale occupation. The inhabitants, excuse me, were transforming the natural landscape through monumental terracing, which we had considered such a characteristically Lydian approach to urban development. So just as the Romans lived in and adapted the remains of older civilizations, so too might the Lydians. In any event, it forces us to reconsider that hypothesis that the Bronze Age capital of this region was at Kaimakcha, and that occupation at Sardis only begins in the late Bronze Age or early in the Iron Age, as the ancient historians wrote, and as archaeology had seemed to confirm until a couple summers ago. Sardis may have been an important settlement even earlier than Kaimakcha, and the Lydians may have been correct in claiming a deep antiquity and long history for their capital. Our excavations on Field 49 then have contributed greatly to our understanding of the earliest periods of Sardis. This hill was densely occupied in the Hellenistic and Roman eras, and they're important remains, but I wanted to turn now to a lower terrace, which offers important insights into Roman Sardis. In 1981, we discovered the corner of a temple here called the Wadi B Temple, and concluded that it was a temple of the Imperial cult. Here. We returned to this area in 2013 in order to put this temple into its larger urban context. We learned that it was part of a great sanctuary terrace, which we called Field 55, occupying the very center of the city. The temple itself, one of Sardis's most important and luxurious sanctuaries, had been deliberately dismantled at some point, and its architectural remains, sculptures, and inscriptions were reused in late Roman constructions, which are best preserved on the east side of the terrace. At the top, you see one of two figural Corinthian capitals from the temple, and a block from its architrave, which bears an inscription, originally in gilded bronze letters, which seems to name the Roman Senate, and so identified this building as a Neocorit temple, a temple belonging to the province of Asia of the Imperial cult. So in a sense, we've learned more about the sanctuary and temple by digging here than we would have by digging the temple itself. But what was the heir? What buildings were the heir to these marble blocks and sculptures, the spolia from the temple of the Imperial cult? After 4 years of excavation in 2016, we finally cleared that pile of debris that you see on the slide and found a huge wall built entirely of spolia, of inscriptions and statue bases and column drums and other detritus from the temple. This extraordinary feature puzzled us until further excavation revealed a road and what seems to be the remains of a gate. You can see one of the massive uprights of reused colossal inscriptions still toppled in situ, showing, it seems, that this was a huge fortification wall which enclosed this central region of Sardis in the 5th or 6th century AD, a major transformation of the late Roman city, which is at least as significant as the temple of the Imperial cult. This new fortification, if that's what it is, would have been strategically located to take advantage of the natural and man-made topography, enclosing this terrace, following the vaults of the stadium, and perhaps up to the theater. We have no trace of its continuation standing above the surface along this route, but erosion and spoliation would have removed all traces of later building here. Only here in this very low point has silting preserved the wall. If this is true, it's an important event, as I say, in the urban history of Sardis. These buildings were all toppled in a massive earthquake, leaving the blocks stacked like dominoes and splitting the terrace with fissures more than 9 meters deep. This earthquake seems to date to the early 7th century AD and has been found, as we'll see, throughout the site. The earthquake also destroyed late Roman houses on top of the hill and a shop or taverna just outside the fortification, preserving really remarkable domestic assemblages and wall paintings under the debris. These attest to the affluent lifestyle of these late Roman Sardians, at least those within the fortification. Among our priorities then was to learn more about these houses on top of the terrace, which occupied the former sanctuary of the Imperial cult and which formed a sort of late Roman Pompeii, their domestic assemblages and equipment preserved by the disaster, and also to learn more about the earthquake which brought an end to urban occupation throughout Sardis. The first rooms we excavated were filled with remarkable collections and even the remains of one of the inhabitants of the house. They contained, for instance, 5 iron spatha swords, iron folding chairs, glass vessels, weights, a marble table, and a host of other really fascinating artifacts. An adjacent room had 3 hanging lamps with glass lanterns suspended from bronze chains, a flask, iron locks, horse trappings, weights, and other artifacts. The contents, again, of this room at the moment that the earthquake struck. A courtyard of this house seems to have been in the midst of either renovation or dismantling, with column shafts and window mullions and a terracotta window screen piled, awaiting either reuse or salvage. At the far end, you see a half stair which would have ascended to the 2nd story of the house and which has collapsed to the floor during that earthquake. The house seems to have been well supplied with latrines. One of them is in the courtyard and the other in a room to the north, draining into a massive drain that was cut through the house at a later moment. Samples from this drain and from the latrine have been examined for parasites, and they conclude that the late Romans were surprisingly healthy with only a few intestinal bugs. When we expanded this excavation to the north a couple of years ago, however, the situation was, and it's typical for Sardis, entirely different. Archaeologists Francis Gallart Marquez, Jessica Plant, and Tyler Walford have been uncovering a series of rooms here that are quite different in character. Jess found that one of the walls of the rooms had collapsed essentially intact with arched windows and courses of brick. And as she excavated, I had dreams or sort of nightmares about what we'd find underneath this fallen wall. Had it collapsed onto people sitting at dinner, and we'd find all their equipment and their bodies crushed on the floor. Unfortunately not. When she uncovered the floor beneath, it was completely bare. The area had been abandoned well before the destruction. Francis, meanwhile, had been exposing a large marble-paved courtyard just to the west with raised platforms on at least 2 sides. These were equipped with a water basin draining out to the south and other rather elaborate hydraulic features that we don't quite understand yet. But again, unlike the courtyard to the south, this was almost completely empty of finds, certainly without the rich assemblages we found in earlier seasons. So what's the difference between these 2 houses, or these 2 areas, one of which is vibrantly occupied at the moment of the earthquake, the other one abandoned? Is this one house, part of which was abandoned for some reason, or was it a second house which had fallen empty? The discovery last season of a door connecting the 2 areas suggests that these were originally 2 separate houses because the door was crudely cut through the wall and was probably cut to drain the hydraulic features in the courtyard, to drain the hydraulic features in the courtyard out through that drain to the south. In any event, there is a great deal to learn about this field, and we were again hoping to do more this summer, but we'll have to wait for a future season. Well, a final area of excavation has been outside the late Roman synagogue at the western edge of the city. We began this project 6 years ago as part of a project to make this area more comprehensible to visitors. We expected to excavate a marble-paved colonnaded road, which we knew existed outside the synagogue, and that would have been quite straightforward. But the work was made complicated by archaeologist Gencay Öztürk's unexpected discovery of an enormous pile of fallen marble blocks just beyond the excavations of earlier years. These proved to belong to a foundation with 4 piers, which had been identified in the 1960s as a tetrapylon, a freestanding structure marking the intersection of 2 sidewalks at the corner of these 2 streets. But further excavation uncovered 4 corresponding piers on the other side of the street, about 13 meters away, and many of the fallen blocks, upon study, proved to be voussoirs with a diameter of about 13 meters, allowing us to reconstruct with some certainty a monumental Roman arch spanning the colonnaded avenue here just at the entrance to the city. The 13-meter span is, I'm told, the widest known in the Roman world. I show the Arch of Titus for comparison. And we see now that the western entrance to the city was dominated by this enormous structure greeting visitors coming from Smyrna and the coast. One of our projects for this summer was to document each of these blocks through photogrammetry and 3D modeling for a publication by Ursula Quatember and others. This Roman avenue was flanked by colonnades, and we've long known that these were paved with mosaics, whose geometric patterns resemble those of the synagogue. Parts of these, as I say, were excavated in the 1960s, but we've always kept them covered with earth and gravel to protect them from tourist traffic here. In 2017, we uncovered a small area of the mosaic just where the sidewalk led through one of the side vaults of the monumental arch. This had been cleared to just above the mosaic pavement in the 1960s, but it turns out they hadn't actually exposed the mosaic itself. And when we did so, we found that it was inscribed with the patron's name. It says that the most magnificent count of consular rank, Flavius Maionius, paved the sidewalk. Consularis, a vice governor. The name of the man responsible for this project is derived, as we saw, from the ancient pre-Homeric name of this region, Maionia, and apparently this is a local boy made good. We know nothing else about this man or when he lived, but the corresponding mosaics on the other side of the street are dated by coins to the late 6th century AD, a period when conventional wisdom has often been that the cities of the Eastern Roman Empire were in decline, so that one might not expect major projects to update the urban infrastructure. Now, in 1963, long before we recognized the monumental arch here, archaeologists had discovered a peculiar feature, the so-called packed columns area, a solid packing of layer upon layer of marble column shafts laid horizontally in solid cement. When we discovered that this was an arch, we recognized or hypothesized that this could belong to a repair or reinforcement of its northern pier, buttressing the foundations which maybe had become unstable. And we can associate that repair with a late antique building inscription, which was found just here in 1970, recording that somebody named Maionius had, quote, obeyed and skillfully executed a mighty foundation which is stronger than, and then it breaks off. This must be the same Maionius. We have then a major urban renewal project here in the western part of the city in which the arch was repaired and the mosaics renewed. And just like in Field 55, this region of the city in the late 6th century seems to have been a complex mix of abandoned or repurposed spaces and vibrant progressive urban life and renewal, making large investments in the urban infrastructure. And like in Field 55, this was all brought to naught within a relatively few years. The arch collapsed in a massive earthquake, and this is clear from the way the blocks fell. You can see the keystones there circled in red, which are fallen directly below the apices of the arch and were embedded in the marble pavement below. This earthquake is dated by coins to the early 7th century AD, and that must be the same that also brought down the south portico of the road, the synagogue, buildings in Field 55, as we saw, and also even the Temple of Artemis, now Sardis had been utterly demolished by earthquakes in the past, notably in 17 AD. But at that time, the Roman Imperial government offered aid and relief, and within a generation or two, Sardis was largely rebuilt. This time, though, the collapse left the major road through Sardis, indeed, the major road from Izmir to inland Anatolia, completely blocked. The Temple of Artemis, the houses in Field 55, and other buildings never restored or reoccupied. To return to that mosaic, how are we going to preserve or display this new mosaic? We didn't want to rebury it as we've reburied the rest of the sidewalk. And luckily, the American Embassy in Ankara came to our rescue with a wonderful 2-year grant to preserve and protect the mosaic and the Lydian Gate nearby. A team of conservators and local women took this on. Many of the tessera were loose and had to be remortared in place, like loose teeth or something. Others were covered with concretion as hard as rock, obscuring the original colors. The conservators and workwomen worked with brushes and dental tools and other hand tools, and these sufficed for a lot of the mosaic, but some parts were covered with millimeters of rock-hard concretion. More, excuse me, than dental tools could easily penetrate. And the tessera were broken and loose, and so we risked damaging them in cleaning. A real lifesaver came with the extraordinarily generous donation in 2017 by Ed Teppo, a specialist in laser technology, of a Linton Phoenix conservation laser. This cutting-edge technology is used in high-end museums around the world, but rarely on archaeological sites. And conservators Tony Siegel and Carol Snow in particular arranged for the manufacturer to send one to us. It took many months of Baha's labor and Teoman Yalçınkaya's and the help of 3 ministries to get it into Turkey, but it finally arrived in time to be invaluable in cleaning the mosaic without damage, safely and effectively, in a fraction of the time it would have taken to do so by hand. To protect the mosaic while leaving it visible, that generous grant from the American Embassy allowed us to build a glass floor, which we completed last season with a sign explaining the situation to visitors. Nearby is the gate through the Lydian fortification, which I mentioned earlier, where 1,000 years before the arch was built, the main road still entered the city at this same point. Last summer, we also finished a long program of conservation of this gate as well as part of the same grant from the American Embassy. One of the problems with all these structures is how to explain them to visitors. The gate has been chopped off at the ankles and gives no sense of its original grandeur. As you can see, this is a really peculiar and confusing area, and despite our ongoing program of signage and reconstruction drawing, I think most visitors walk away completely perplexed by centuries of monumental building all intersecting here. So one way of making this part of Sardis more easily understood by visitors is by using an augmented reality app, which we're now developing this summer. This will allow visitors to use their own smartphones to superimpose reconstructions of these buildings on the existing remains as they look through the camera of the phone. And this technology is becoming more and more familiar. Think of Pokemon Go or IKEA or something, but also many scientific and architectural and engineering applications. And it will allow visitors to immerse themselves in the ancient experience of these structures without our physically reconstructing the remains. Architects Kellyanna Luludis and Zhao Sheng and others have spent countless hours making 3D models of this area. And with the help of archaeologists and architects, are building this model now. And these will be a new way of experiencing and learning about ancient Sardis. I mentioned that the excavation of the road and arch really started as a site management project involved in preservation and presentation. At the western side of the city, Professor Hanfmann, as I said, excavated and restored the Bath Gymnasium complex with a synagogue in its southeastern corner. This is the largest synagogue in the ancient world, richly paved with mosaics and its walls decorated with panels of colored marble revetment. It was equipped with menorahs, lions, a huge marble table, liturgical objects, inscriptions in the marble panels, and the mosaic panels and wall revetments recorded the names of those who had contributed to the building, including citizens of Sardis and God-fearers. Sardis had a strong Jewish population since the Hellenistic period, and we found menorahs not only in this synagogue, but in other parts of the city as well. The extraordinary power of the Jewish community at Sardis is attested not only by the opulence of the building, but by the fact that it took over part of the public imperial baths at a time when this quarter of Sardis was apparently thriving. And that the synagogue inherited the stones and dedications from one of Sardis's most famous pagan sanctuaries, the sanctuary of Cybele, the mother goddess, whose temple was apparently dismantled at this time, and its pieces reused in the synagogue. The 2 pairs of endorsed lions flanking the table were already perhaps 700 years old when they were repurposed, converted from lions of Cybele to lions of Judah, and you see David Mitten excavating the famous Cybele monument here. The restoration of the synagogue was one of the great achievements of Professor Hanfmann's years as director, overseen by the legendary conservator Larry Majewski. The team lifted all the mosaics and reset them in reinforced concrete beddings. We wouldn't do this now, of course, but they did make this one of the few ancient buildings where you can safely walk on the original mosaic pavements. But This building was never meant to be open to the air, and despite the best efforts of 1960s reinforced concrete, the mosaics have begun to crack and disintegrate over the last 50 years. Water enters through tiny cracks, causing iron rebar to rust and expands, which widens the cracks, causes further incursion, until finally the mosaics will fail and have to be completely relifted and reset, which would be a disaster. The only way to avoid this happening is to build a protective shelter roof over the building. Across the street is the Lydian fortification, whose discovery 40 years ago so changed our understanding of Lydian Sardis. This, of course, has been under a temporary roof since it was excavated, so nobody, not even members of our expedition, can normally see this most monumental structure of the period of Alyattes and Croesus. But that, of course, was never meant to be a long-term solution, and we've watched the unbaked earth structure slowly be damaged by humidity and rising damp. So a group of conservators, architects, engineers, and archaeologists has been meeting now for more than 10 years to find a coordinated solution to these problems. The synagogue is more straightforward. They've designed a lightweight shelter of steel and fabric with dancing panels to lighten the aesthetic effect. We need not keep out every drop of rain, but this will ensure that the mosaics do not disintegrate any further and make it possible to start another program to restore those mosaics to their original condition. The mud brick fortification is more challenging since the roof is not sufficient on its own. We also need to encapsulate the mud brick to protect it from the dry air, which causes the mud brick to sort of gradually flake off. Our plan is to build a skin of modern mud brick to protect the ancient face using the same sources and clay and colors of clay as the ancient builders used, and so recreating the original as closely as possible. The architects and engineers had worked most of this out, but we wanted to make sure that it would work. So over the last few years, we've built a full-scale replica at the compound, and when we were satisfied with that, last summer we constructed a shell against the ancient mud brick where it had been cut through in the 1950s by the modern highway. The sort of funny-looking, sticky-outy bricks are meant to indicate that this isn't the face of the wall, but a section through it, and I admit it's not immediately clear. This was apparently a success and has already apparently successfully weathered a couple major storms during the winter. These two roofs will not only protect these important buildings, but also transform visitors' experience of the site, making the synagogue a more inviting and less oven-like structure and opening the Lydian fortification to visitors. I will end with perhaps the most satisfying project to me in the last few years. The Temple of Artemis is the fourth largest Ionic temple in the world and has been the great landmark of the site since antiquity. Early travelers studied, painted, and photographed the two columns that have stood above ground since antiquity, but it was Howard Crosby Butler of Princeton University who undertook the first large-scale excavation at Sardis just before the First World War. But in the centuries since Butler's excavation, the temple had turned dark and ugly, stained by black cyanobacteria and crusty lichen, which not only discolored the stone, but also eat it away, causing permanent damage. When Michael Morris suggested that we could clean this biogrowth from the temple, I initially scoffed, envisioning crews scrubbing the marble blocks with toothbrushes. But he developed a new technique for killing the microorganisms by using a safe and lightweight biocide to kill the bacteria and lichen. And in 2014, the Kaplan Fund in New York offered a generous grant for a 5-year project to clean the temple. The process is slow and sort of deliberately low tech, using this common biocide and leaving it to bake in the sun for a few days. And so it seeps into the stone, killing not only its surface colonies, but also the bacteria that have entered the crystalline structure, as I understand it. It's therefore much more long lasting. And over the years, we've tried various other means of removing this disfiguring guck, but after a few years, it begins to grow back. But now, at the end of the project, even test blocks that Michael Morris and Hiroko Karia experimented on 7 or 8 years ago remain clean and free of regrowth. We anticipate that if we monitor and spray it every few years, we'll be able to maintain its condition and not have to do it again. When we began this project, we employed for the first time women in our field crew, and they have taken the project completely into their own hands, assembling the scaffolding around the columns and working fearlessly 6 stories above the ground, returning the temple to its former rich glow. They've taken great and justified pride in their achievements and will explain the process at length to visitors when they weren't working on top of the column, of course. The temple now glows in the evening sun as it did in antiquity. And looking back at old photos, it's hard to see how we found the dark stained marble somehow romantic. It's hard for us even to remember how black the temple was before the project, and so we left the top of one column unclean to demonstrate the transformation. And this was one of our big questions when we began. Would it look too clean, and would we regret it? And I can answer that with a definitive no. There's a real satisfaction in following through on our responsibility to look after the great buildings that are entrusted to us. Another big responsibility we take on, of course, is to publish the results of all this work. We're very fortunate to have a full-time staff at Harvard directed by Baha Yildirim. For a number of years, this effort was led by Teresa Huntsman and Brianna Bricker, and they made remarkable progress with many manuscripts. Last year, we welcomed Carrie Sullivan as research editor to oversee the publications program. Carrie has spent many years overseeing the publications of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens and brings the perfect experience and energy to our publication program. Sorry, here is Carrie at Sardis last summer. In 2018, they brought out Jane Evans' coin volume, coins found since 1973, now available from Harvard University Press, and also for free download on our website. The coins from Professor Evans's book are also available online as a searchable database, which I hope will be much more useful in a way to scholars all over the world. This is, I think, one of the largest databases of coins from archaeological contexts in the world, and will be linked with other major coin databases like those at the ANS. Last summer, Georg Petzel's publication of the inscriptions from Sardis, found since 1958, was printed, bringing to a conclusion the work of many of the world's great epigraphers, including Louis Robert, who came from the very first year of excavations. We are at this moment printing Fikret Yegul's monograph on the Temple of Artemis, a project he's worked on for 30 years with stone-by-stone plans and elevations at 1:20, which will be in a separate box with large fold-out sheets in a rather 19th century fashion. The study of Professor Hanfmann's excavations at sectors HOB and PC have gone on for even longer. Andrew Ramage has worked for more than 40 years on this critical sector of HOB with its long sequence of Lydian occupation from the Bronze Age through the 6th century, and Nancy Ramage has worked equally long on the publication of Pactolus Cliff. This volume is now in page proof and will be published this fall. I have to say that Carrie, Brianna, and these scholars make a formidable team, and it's very satisfying for me to see these books appear in quick succession. And they're now bringing together Andrew Seeger's long-awaited final publication of the synagogue at Sardis, another of the site's most famous monuments, which Andy has also been working on for many years. He is joined too by younger scholars, Marcus Routman, Jane Evans, and Vanessa Rousseau, to bring this complicated, important project to fruition. And this is one of the real joys of working at Sardis. Not just the joy of making new discoveries, adding to scientific knowledge and all that, but sharing these discoveries with and training the younger generation. Each year, a few dozen graduate and undergraduate students take part in the excavations and gain unique training in many aspects of archaeology, while we enjoy their expertise and energy. These youngsters are the future of archaeology, of course, and some of them, like Teoman Yalçın-Kaya, arrived half a century ago and have stayed involved with the project for most of their lives. Now, I look forward to seeing some of our current students likewise remaining involved in the project for the next 50 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think everybody would be clapping now and are probably clapping, but only, unlike normally, we can just not see it. Thank you very much. I think that was a fantastic lecture. Can I ask people to... Can you not hear me? Nick, can you not hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you.
All right. So can I ask people to start gathering to write their questions down in the Q&A? Meanwhile, I also have a question, and I must confess that I'm always rather flabbergasted when I hear about Sardis, because half of the time I don't understand where I am in the site. That's probably due to me, nothing else. But what I wanted to ask is, I mean, you have these massive stratigraphies, incredibly complicated. I mean, layers and periods seem to spring up where you don't expect them and otherwise. But do you have a kind of an idea of how the city grew and shrunk and grew again? I mean, the Roman one is obviously much bigger. Was the earlier area of Sardis inhabited during the Roman period, or did they move the center? So
I think it seems that the Lydian city is as big or bigger than the Roman city. We have Lydian occupation houses and sanctuaries and so forth extending 600 meters or something north of the highway, and farther than that to the south, a broad sort of expanse of probably sort of lightly occupied, not very dense, but very extensive occupation outside the city walls. And the occupation within the city walls, you know, obviously we have so little occupation exposed archaeologically at that level that we can't talk about density, but there are clues. If I had to guess, I would say that it's pretty dense. We've gone, you know, we find houses sort of cheek by jowl, jammed up against one another in a number of places, and not big areas which were obviously sort of left open in the Lydian period. So I'm thinking of a fairly densely occupied city. And in this, the Persian period is really the outlier. And it's very peculiar then. What we find is that the Lydian houses and the palace and others sit unoccupied, robbed, but without traces of occupation for those 200, 250 years or something. And then, and occupation is maybe deliberately pushed out of the fortified center to the region on the Pactolus where Herodotus saw them. And that's where this sort of misunderstanding of Herodotus, it's not a misunderstanding, he's completely correct. That's where Sardis was in 499. But that doesn't make it where Lydian Sardis was. Just last summer, 2 summers ago, I'm sorry, Age Alper, I'm afraid who I didn't have a chance to mention her work, but she found for the first time medieval remains of the 14th, 15th century in the city centers. And that came again as a complete surprise. We'd never found anything that late. We've got traces of an 8th or 9th century cemetery, which I'm afraid I also didn't, AD cemetery, not traces, we've got 40 something individuals from it. So this really interesting cemetery of this very little known period. And I'm sorry I have to cut off all this other stuff, but you know, every time we do something, we find something new, which of course is the goal of it. Indeed. So we learn things, and what we learn is often that we were wrong, but that's good.
That's part of archaeology, no? That's part of the fun.
Exactly.
We have lots of questions now. So McGuire. Hi Nick, greetings from Buffalo. I'm curious about the place of Sardis in Hittite archives. Any presence at all? Don McGuire.
There is one word that has been, and I can't remember the Hittite for it, but there's one word that has been possibly suggested to be related to the word for Sardis. And I'd have to look at my notes again. And not being a linguist, I find it very difficult to evaluate those arguments of linguistic similarity. So it has been claimed, yes, that they found the name for Sardis in Hittite archives, but it's not immediately obvious. And there aren't, you know, Hittite accounts of visiting this city out there. So I would have to plead ignorance on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, but it was, we know, it has been mentioned in the
yes, yes. Well, it's possible. It's possible. Hittite geography of Western Asia Minor is you know, one of the great knotty problems, of course.
Absolutely. Yes.
And yeah.
Orhan Efe Yavuz, we jump to a completely different topic. Is there any plan for ancient DNA analysis on the skeletal remains from the Lydian period? Question 1. Also, has there been a project regarding to saving and documenting the tumuli surrounding Sardis before their complete destruction by the looters?
Oh,
yeah.
Both of them good questions. On the former, I can say yes, and that we have actually DNA from that 8th, 9th century cemetery on Field 49. We have results from DNA on those, which were interestingly a mother and son buried at separate times, but related to one another. And I would have to pass on to David Reich for the details of that. The Lydian material has been sampled and gone to Ankara for analysis, and Yilmaz Erdal and his new lab is going to be working on those. So that's in progress, but I can't report on the results yet.
Okay, so there is
very
the
exciting stuff
going on, and then the second question: saving and documenting the tumuli.
Well, the tumuli we document periodically. Saving them is we go out. They have been, we do document them. It's not just a question of documentation. It's a question of saving them, and that means maintaining. It's now a huge Cetolana. It's 74 square kilometers of first-degree Cetolana, and we're hoping that will be preserved. There's always question, and of course farmers want to use the land and looters want to get in there and use them. I would like to see controls on the use of large machinery and so forth. But that it's an ongoing problem at Bin Tepe as elsewhere, and it's a really unfortunate thing that the Lydians did bury their dead with gold, and everybody knows that, so it attracts looters.
Yes. It's a bit of a tragedy, indeed.
It's a tragedy, yes, but we do what we can.
Absolutely. Sarah Cahill would like to know where the soil samples are being processed and how is that done?
The soil samples are being processed at the University of Kansas by Joel Spencer, who does this. I guess OSL, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this either, but OSL is more often used for much older sediments, and for historical periods, it's not as common. So he's working on those now. I find it hard to believe that you can figure out how long it's been since a grain of sand has seen the light, but they say it can be done, and so I believe him. And it has been done successfully at other sites. So we are waiting from Kansas, and we were all ready to do. This is another thing that got interrupted by the coronavirus. We were a week away from starting that analysis when everything was shut down.
It will reopen, Nick. It will reopen.
He's working on it now. Yes. He is working on it now, which is a miracle.
All right. Barbara Burrell has a question that I also crossed my mind.
Yes.
Is there any firmer date for the foundation of the Wadi B temple?
I would probably want to defer to Baha and others on that, but it does seem to be Julio-Claudian. The architecture, the sculpture, the inscriptions are I think good for Julio-Claudian date, since it's a temple of the Imperial cult, and it does seem to be a koinon, a Neocarit temple. You've got to find which emperor that is, and you could, in theory, with the right inscription, pin it down to the reign of a particular emperor. I'm personally partial to Claudius, but we've got lots of. It could be someone else. It could be Trajan. It could be another of the Julio-Claudian, or one of the Flavian emperors for that matter, but it's in that period, in the sort of towards the middle decades of the 1st century AD.
All right, thank you. Alan Greaves, There is clearly a centuries or even millennia long tradition of terracing and deep deposition of soil on the summit of the hill in field 49. How do you account for this? Is it a unique response to specific geographic realities of the location, or a regional architectural tradition?
I tend to see the tradition of deliberate terracing as something that's very Lydian, and as we said, goes back now apparently to the early Bronze Age, and that I would like to see the Lydian walls that we know about, the 7th, 8th century, 6th century BC walls, as sort of establishing the outline of the hill, which then get built over and over and over. So we have, as I showed, the Lydian terrace wall with the Hellenistic terrace wall with early Roman terrace wall, and every century or so they take it apart and put it back together in a slightly different way, which makes it very difficult to understand. But it does seem to be something that's culturally determined. And what's odd to me is that they choose this hill in the first place, and that's something that we don't understand yet. Why, if you've got a hill that's sloping at a 45-degree angle, why choose that one when you have to import tens of thousands of cubic meters of fill and build these giant walls? What's special about it? And one could speculate, but you have to start with start with the facts, and those are the facts that we're getting, and the explanation must follow that they really want to develop this central area.
Yeah.
It is very odd.
Yeah.
Excuse me?
It's of course sticks up out, over the plain. You have a good outlook over the plain. Maybe that's
wonderful view, beautiful breezes, a connection to the Acropolis. I didn't mention this, but there's a tunnel that Greenie dug actually, that sort of winds inside the cliffs of the Acropolis from above these hills, and leads up to just below where we have Lydian terraces on the Acropolis. And so we've got this connection between the upper and lower cities there, and that may have been a reason for putting a sort of an elite center there at an early period. And we do have this deposition. I should emphasize also that we have massive erosion, and there are areas where you go right, practically from surface to early Roman or Hellenistic, and we know that there were late Roman buildings there, but they've all been completely eroded away. So you can't just look at what you've got. You've got to think about what you don't have.
That's very difficult. That makes it complicated. But there.
It really does.
Anthony Shepard asks, are the mosaic sidewalks seen as contemporary with the construction of the adjacent synagogue, or with the repair or reconstruction phase?
There's two phases. The sidewalks both have two phases. The earlier one of the 5th century, maybe not so early in the 5th century, the first half of the 5th century, and the second phase in the later 6th century AD. The synagogue is earlier than that, or it's the beginning of construction of the synagogue is a bit earlier than that in the later 4th century, but it also continues into construction continues in the synagogue well into the 5th century, and they're also constantly sort of updating and replacing and repairing. So they're broadly contemporary with the synagogue at present, in our present understanding, being a little bit earlier.
Okay. By the way, Barbara Burrell agrees with your Claudian dating.
Claudius himself. Thank you. That's a joy to learn.
Herkenes asks, I was first to say, thank you very much, Nick, for a great presentation. If there was robbing on such a large scale in the Achaemenid period, where and what did the Persians build with all the spolia? Yes.
Yeah. We've always wanted to find something like, Medangic Kalesi or something at Sardis. Here it is, one of the great centers of the Persian Empire, and we have so little monumental building to show for it. And I think the explanation for that must be that there's a very stark division of the city at this time. And there's a lower city, which really is very ramshackle. And I think always of Herodotus's description of the burning of Sardis in 499, where he says that the houses were made of reeds, and even the houses that were made of mud brick had reed roofs. So the majority of building was very, very flimsy in the lower city, and that burned. But the upper city on the Acropolis is must have been much more monumental. The Ionians didn't even bother to try to take that. And that must be where all those blocks were reused, that they grabbed them and they dragged them somehow up the Acropolis. And there's really so little on that survives on the Acropolis of anything earlier than the Byzantine period. When Professor Hanfmann did pretty extensive excavations up there, he would find there's almost no architecture. There's this one Lydian terrace that we always talk about, but there's very little. There's very little other material. Guzine points out, thank you, Guzine, that some could have been used for the Achaemenid fortifications, and there may well have been Achaemenid. We know that there were Achaemenid fortifications built largely out of spolia, probably largely from the Lydian fortifications. But the spoliation of the palace, for instance, where did those blocks go? And it's not impossible, of course, that there's some building on a neighboring hill that we've simply never found. And I don't want to make too much of my certainty that the whole city was emptied out, but the places that we've excavated so far have all shown not just no buildings, but very little or relatively little pottery as well. And what the pottery that we find is associated with big robbing pits. So it's a weird thing.
It's a weird thing. Well, more excavation needed, I think. So
yeah, and slow. It's so slow.
So then somebody whose name I don't know, but you might, HB Soy says, thank you. Is it that Kaymakçı settlement was a part or a contemporary of the Sardis settlement, or vice versa?
Kaymakçı, as I understand it, is largely a little bit earlier, falls into the sort of gap that we don't have so much of. We've got early bronze. I mean, we've got this much early bronze. We've got what seems to be rather later bronze. And Kaymakçı begins in the middle bronze and the sort of earlier part. Isn't that right? If Chris Roosevelt is there, he can chime in, or Guzine. In the earlier part, in the middle bronze, and the sort of and goes down into the end of the late bronze as well. So there is overlap there. The material is similar in many ways, and it was Chris who visiting the site, and his team visiting the site as we were excavating these early levels, who said, "Oh yeah, look, this is Bronze Age," or confirmed to us that this was Bronze Age. So there is an overlap there, but until we know so much about the layout of the settlement at Kaymakçı, the citadel at Kaymakçı, and almost nothing about Sardis. So it's really hard to talk about how the two communities might have interacted.
Right. I'm going to take the liberty of jump another question from Orhan Efe Yavuz for the moment. Okay. And we also have somebody who would like to participate in the excavations. So yes, we can talk about that later. Then somebody from YouTube asks, any news on the Royal Road?
Royal Road. Again, that's a funny one, because we've got this, as I said, we've got this long, it must be one of the longest continuous or almost continuously used roads in Anatolia, because we have it from about 700 BC going through that Lydian gate and going under the Lydian gate until 2001, when we first came, that was the site of the modern Izmir-Ankara highway, and it was only moved in 2001, and thank God for that, because it was awful having a highway run through your site. But the Royal Road, which Xenophon and others describe of the Persian period, is not that place, because that road was blocked off. The gate was filled in after the Persians capture the city, and that becomes no longer an entrance, and we lose we don't know where the road was or where the entrance to the city was between the Lydian period, between the end of the Lydian period and really the late Roman period. It must have been at a higher level. There was you've got the fortification. It would have been into a mound, and you must have had to go over this rise to get into the city. The topography was probably quite different. And the late Romans, who are really great at moving dirt, just shaved this all down and built their marble avenue directly on top of the Lydian. So we're really missing that whole phase that would belong with the royal road that is described by Xenophon and others.
Okay. Three questions from Doğa Taşlar'dan from you via YouTube. So Cybele's temple was underneath or nearby the synagogue. Do we know the exact location?
No, we don't. We don't. What we have are, we've got blocks of the temple itself, and that's one of the really interesting things. We've got the anta-blocks from the temple with inscriptions, which are very well known, from Antiochus III and his wife and others of the late 3rd century. And we've got lots of spolia that seems quite consistent with the sanctuary of Cybele, but we've never really had a chance to look for Lydian remains in that area, and certainly never found them. They're very deeply buried. The one time that we did reach Lydian nearby, we're under 5 meters and more, 5 to 10 meters of terracing and other fill. So it would be a project to locate that stuff.
And I'm going to ask one more of the questions. Do we know the local Lydian goddess who was overridden by Sardis Artemis? Meaning, who could be the archaic Artemis in Sardis?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Would it be a local Cybele form?
Well, Cybele and Artemis, although modern scholars and maybe even some ancient people get them confused, they're very different goddesses and have different attributes, and are shown separately in a relief that comes from the synagogue. So I don't think it's a question of Artemis replacing Cybele, but the Artemis of Sardis is related closely to the Artemis of Ephesus, as we hear from inscriptions that talk about the founding of the temple of the cult of Artemis at Sardis from that at Ephesus. She's attested as early, but really not earlier than the 6th century BC. We don't have remains of her going back as really early the way they do at Ephesus, for instance. And she's very weird. And there's in Istanbul, if you go to the Istanbul Museum, those of you who are in Istanbul, and you go into the room, where you go to the toilets, that room that's if you go straight instead of turning left into the main building, and behind the door there's a marvelous stele, which was published in, I think, the 2013 Istanbuler Mitteilung, which seems to represent the cult statue of Artemis. It's a gravestone. It's apparently a gravestone of the author suggests it's a gravestone of a priestess of Artemis. And it's a marvelous thing which shows her essentially as a pile of furniture. She's not anthropomorphic. There's little sandals or something sticking out at the bottom, and there's the figure of a woman's head at the top. She's flanked by torches. And it's a marvelous and very peculiar, probably Hellenistic representation of this goddess, who was anything but the Artemis that we sort of expect when we think of a Greek goddess. So she's, if this really is a representation of the archaic statue and not some sort of deliberately weirdly archaizing invention of the Hellenistic period, it reflects some, one would like to think that it reflects a sort of a very local and very non-Greek tradition. but the two of them were then worshipped independently, and the temple of Artemis did not apparently have, there's no evidence for the worship of Cybele in the temple of Artemis, and limited evidence for the presence of Artemis in what we know of in the temple of Cybele, the Metroon, whose remains are built into the synagogue.
I'm going to have to pick the questions a bit here because they keep coming. Catherine Draycott, question via the chat. I have two questions. First, I found it hard to keep track of the relationship between the massive arched gate and the synagogue, but I suppose that I can chase that through the project website and publications or interim reports, question marks. Otherwise, to what extent do you think that the early kings are reliable historical persons as opposed to largely fictions of later periods?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't put a great deal of faith in stories about kings who got drunk and ate their wives and woke up with the wife's hand coming out of his mouth and so forth. It doesn't make, a lot of that is fairly obviously fictional. Whether you can, we don't have independent sources, of course, that we could test them against. And so we tend to accept things that we can't test as, you know, the best truth that we've got. And I don't think that's a very safe method, which is why I wouldn't want to try to reconstruct, you know, anything about Lydian history, even if we had that whole inscription, which seems to record events from early Lydian history from the early 8th and 9th centuries. Even if we had the whole thing, would we think that the late Romans, or whenever that thing was written, not that late, that the Romans really understood that much about Lydian history? Probably not. But they would have had, on the other hand, they would have had the full texts of people like Nicholas of Damascus and Xanthos of Lydia, and those probably had, you know, the pieces of those larger histories that survive for us are the sort of, you know, the really salacious ones, and the really, you know, the really jazzy ones. And there must have been a lot more in there that if we had them, we could extract, but we don't.
Okay, completely different topic. Simon Corcoran would like to know whether any of the new epigraphic discoveries from the Roman city have been in Latin rather than Greek.
Yes, there are some, and you can read all of those in Gary Petzel's book from last summer. There's one Latin inscription which is not in that book, which was found last summer, 2 summers ago. It's a big inscription in big letters, so something monumental, again from that sanctuary of the Imperial cult, and it may have it's probably a name, but we've only got a few letters of it. But it is big.
Oh, and that's the publication is available online, no? You said?
Yes. Mm-hmm. It is on, and very shortly it'll be in the searchable database as well. So you could just look online for Latin, and you'll get them all, or all but one.
All the published ones. Dilek Tutunji, a completely different topic yet again. Wonderful talk, and if possible, I would like to hear more on the biodefense method with the dark material covering the columns for the Temple of Artemis. How it works, I think. I mean, what the material was probably. Was it a special kind of material?
It's something called Preventol, which we at least buy from Italy. It's imported regularly to Turkey and is fairly easily available there. And you dilute it to a certain proportion, and depending I think in part on how bad the infestation is. And I think what we've used, I mean, lots of people have used this stuff as a biocide for many years, and what Michael and Hiroko did that was really different was to leave it in the sun. You cover it with burlap, with saturated burlap and plastic, and leave it in the sun to sort of bake in for a long time, and then scrub gently to remove the stuff and then use this preventol again. And that really kills the stuff as opposed to just cleaning it. And so they don't like me to use, I mean, it's hard not to use the word clean, but they say that's not really what we're doing. What they're doing is more like disinfecting the temple, or, you know, removing the biofilm.
Has it been used elsewhere already since you used it in the temple in Sardis?
A few people have tried it, have asked about it, and I don't know that others, people of Aphrodisias Metropolis, a number of other people have sort of inquired into it, and we sort of discussed like sending some of our some of the ladies who really know how to use this stuff. They became really expert at it, and they could go off and sort of train people there. It's a nice technique because it's quite safe. You know, within a few weeks, you know, you've got grass growing between the stones again. I mean, you clean it out, and so it's not dangerous in that sense. You'll see them wearing masks and protective clothing and so forth, obviously, but it's a fairly mild and safe material. And as I say, it's called preventol and is fairly easily obtained. And I'd be happy to, you know, we'd of course be happy to share the experiences in more detail with anybody who's interested.
Okay. Anya Slavish would like to know, since when did Sardis refer to itself as Protochtonos? How far does this go back?
I think the texts that we have are 2nd century AD. Are there 1st century? I'd have to look whether they're 1st century, but the ones that I'm thinking of are 2nd century. They're Antonine. It is a unique or rare word.
Apparently, HB Soy is Hussein Burak Soy from Mitte. There are quite a few more. Robert Van would like to know whether there has been any further work done in what we called the hillside chambers.
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, that's quick. Eda Nalçacı would like to know, to ask whether there are any artifact discoveries from the archaic period which can be related to Cyprus. Very specific.
Few, if any. I can't think of any offhand. I can't think of clearly Cypriot pottery. There's a couple pieces of what seems to be North Syrian pottery imported from North Syria, but proper, you know, the sort of classic Cypriot pottery, for instance, I don't think we have that. Not that anybody has recognized, at least. So no, that's really interesting, isn't it?
Are you good to go a bit more, or?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Al Ertenu asked, did Hadrian visit Sardis? If he did, is there a temple of an imperial cult dedicated to him in Sardis? For example, the Wadi B one, but we have now established that that's Claudian.
Well, so in Fikret Yegul's book, which is, as I saw, you know, right now in production and will be available, inshallah, shortly, and also on the website, he makes the argument that the temple of Artemis was converted from a single temple of Artemis to a double-celled joint temple of Artemis on the one side and the imperial cult on the other. And he argues that that takes place in the reign of Hadrian. We've known for a long time that we have about the double cella and the imperial cult on the east. The question is when that takes place, and he makes a strong argument that it dates to the reign of Hadrian. He talks in his book, which you can read, about the date of the reign of Hadrian and the circumstances. There are other options possible, and there is archaeological evidence that, to my mind, doesn't fit with that interpretation. And Fikret discusses that as well, so you can read the book and decide for yourself.
Okay, fair enough. Veronica Callas, Anything more about the Byzantine period? You mentioned a newly found 8th, 9th century AD cemetery. Where is this? Near the known churches? Where are those late antique houses you showed at the beginning with some interesting Christian finds? Can you tie these to the urban transformation of the city in late antiquity and Middle Ages?
Well,
I think that there is another question related to that from Anne Kuttner. I'm curious about your current take on traces of specifically Christian aspect on late Roman Sardis and Sardines.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. Let's see, the Byzantine houses, the houses from which most of that pottery, from the places from which most of that pottery that I showed at the very beginning, those were in Pactolus North, in the sector that later produced that also had a Lazarid church, and underneath that an earlier, a fourth century Basilica church, and those are published by Hans Buchwald fairly recently. And also late Roman houses. There was a whole Byzantine and medieval and Islamic village there that was excavated, produced lots and lots of really interesting material, and that's being worked on. There's also, of course, the Acropolis. And I didn't show the Byzantine walls of the Acropolis, which are now being surveyed and studied and recorded really sort of properly for the first time. They're very difficult to study or to record because it's so steep. You can't see them. And so drones are really the only way to do it. And before drone technology, you would have to rappel down the sides or something to do it, and nobody wants to do that. So Ben Anderson and Jordan Pickett are working on that material, and they've got really interesting ideas about that. That's really the major Byzantine presence at Sardis, and it was really big. It's a major citadel, big power center, a major undertaking to bring all that stone, much of which comes from the lower city. So after the lower city sort of falls into ruin or something, presumably, and a lot of those buildings are abandoned, there's another major spoliation effort to bring material up from the lower city and rebuild it into these new Byzantine walls. And presumably at that time, any stone from earlier Roman, Hellenistic, Lydian buildings that they could find up there, they would have used, because the alternative is bringing it all up from 300 meters lower. But it's a spectacular wall, and if you've gone up to see it, it's one of the most wonderful monuments of Sardis. I just didn't have a chance to talk about it, but as I say, Ben Anderson and Jordan Pickett are working on this, looking at both at the archaeology, at early travelers, and of course at the wall themselves, and finding all kinds of interesting things.
Okay. Anubis van den Hoek and John Herman would like to know the following. Your discovery that the hill was originally unbuildable suggests to me that it was chosen as a fortress to command the region. Have you thought about this possibility?
Well, yes, it's a fortress, but of course you've got a fortress. You've got a much better fortress up top. On the Acropolis. And what we again would like to know is how early the Acropolis was fortified. You hear about King Meles taking carrying a lion around, but that doesn't help us. And then the Sardis, a big question actually is, why Sardis? Why do you choose to fortify this place rather than any one of the sort of hills that are up and down the Hermus Valley? And this citadel really is one of the better ones. It's the right size. It's quite easily protected. So to my mind, one of the early things that draws people to this site is this impregnable citadel, which Polybius describes as the strongest place in the world, and Greeny used to point out that it was never captured. It was captured and besieged all the time, but nobody ever succeeded in actually capturing it. They always had to bribe somebody to let them in. And so it was, so it's really a very, very defensible spot. And then if you're going to say, well, that's the draw of the site, then why do you then develop this hill further down if you've got a citadel up above? We don't know whether those lower hills were ever proper fortifications. I suspect sort of not, that the terrace walls acted more as sort of symbolic distinctions between one part of the city and another. But of course, we don't know how high they rose. We know how high they rose as terraces, but whether they rose above that as independent walls, we have absolutely no idea.
Like I said,
it wouldn't surprise me.
More excavation.
But it's all fallen down. We're lucky to find anything.
Yeah. So 2 questions about connections to elsewhere. Maya Vasileva asks, any traces of the Cimmerians at Sardis? We have 2 independent types of sources about their attacks, the Greek authors and the Assyrian documents. That's one. And then Leila Topal, I have to go up, sorry. Ask whether there are, I remember that she asked, was there any connection between the Lydians and the Etruscans?
Both good questions. The Cimmerians remain archaeologically, at Sardis at least, and in many places, very elusive. Although we have these accounts of Assyrians from Assyrian sources and Greek sources and others, it turns out to be quite difficult to identify them archaeologically. And although we've tried, and I showed at the very beginning a bunch of skeletons that Professor Hanfmann excavated at Hob, and he thought that was the remains of the Cimmerian destruction. And then only later did they realize that the pottery from that level is, a good generation or 2 earlier than the Cimmerians. And so it's got to be some other event. But once you take that out, we don't have traces. We don't have traces of the Cimmerians. We've got interesting, a number of sort of animal style objects, horse trappings, spear or scabbard. What are the round discs at the end of a scabbard called? It's got a special shape. And we've got a number of them, including some of that were being manufactured at the spot. They're unfinished. And they are in this sort of animal style. They're a little late, at least the context that they come from is a little late for the Cimmerians, but Greeny used to hypothesize about, some of these Central Asian nomads maybe settling down and maintaining some of these sort of horsey traditions at Sardis. And that is not, not at all impossible. The Lydians were famous for horsemanship, and so they would have had a place in this society. But in terms of hard evidence, it's really you can't point to any, I'm afraid. As for the Etruscans, that's of course a very controversial thing, and I think it will depend on who you ask. I would say, one thing I would throw, and I will, in an article I'm writing now, I will throw into the ring there, that the Lydians have these very distinctive cooking stands. It's sort of like a horseshoe shaper. It's a tapering cylinder with a piece cut out of it. And we get them in 8th century levels. They're very common. It's a standard way of cooking in Lydia. And you find them in Italy from the early 7th century down into the 6th and later too. But they're rare in Greece. They're rare anywhere else. They're really common in these 2 places, and you find them in Italy only in the region that is sort of associated with Etruria. So that's a distinctive connection, which I wouldn't want to put too much weight on, but I think but those are the kinds of connections I'd look for. People have been doing DNA analysis of cows and people in Tuscany, and made really interesting claims about this. But we can also look at it from a more archaeological point of view, and that is a connection, I think. And of course, there's a lot people have talked about this for generations. You got tumulus burials and all kinds of things that look very, very Anatolian. But it was debated already in antiquity, famously.
That connections are a good moment to stop, because there are more questions, and questions keep coming. Maybe Elif can also turn her video on. Those of you who have been following the rapidly growing numbers of chats will have seen that if you enjoyed this lecture, we are intending to have more online lectures, so please register either for via ARIT or via the BIA. So there are several events that we are planning for the near future, because we think that since so many of the archaeologists can't come to Turkey, they might have time to give an online lecture when they immediately have the chance to reach out to the world. So all the chat comments have been tremendously positive. You have lots and lots of many thank yous. This was a fantastic lecture, and I can only agree with that. It was very great, a very nice overview. And I'm sure that Elif has something to add.
Well, thank you very much. I also have questions, but I'm gonna maybe talk to you later since there were so many questions here. But yeah, very informative, and it seems like it's one of those sites you can have 5-10 lectures on, because there's so much going on. So yeah, hopefully we'll hear from Dan soon.
Yeah, I always think of these talks being sort of like meze. You can't have very much of any one thing.
The good things about meze is that most of them are very good. So,
yeah.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was a very
thank you so much, and I regret deeply not being able to visit Ankara. I still haven't seen the new institute, and look forward to seeing it as soon as possible.
Indeed. I hope that you will be able to do some work in Turkey at some point.
Inshallah.
Because, you told us that you still hope that you will be able to go at some point. We are keeping our fingers crossed, not only for you, but for many of our colleagues, obviously. So
for all of us, yes.
First try to conquer altogether this pandemic. Thank you very much. It was a great lecture. Thank you. And also for answering so many questions. And like I said, there are even more. The student who asked whether it would be possible to attend excavations would be very welcome to contact somebody at the BIA, and we will be happy to answer you.
Yes.
Or Nick probably himself
like.
will also be happy to answer, and Nick's email can easily be found online.
Yeah, it shouldn't be that hard.
All right, thank you very much. Have a nice evening, everybody, or day for those of you on the other side of the ocean. It was an early start, but I'm sure it was worth it. Thank you very much, and hope to see many of you again in the following up lectures and events. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
It was good, no?